I had learned over the years that the only thing more dangerous than a boss who believed themselves untouchable was a boss who talked too much. He didn't understand discretion. He was a blur of opinions and confessions, a man who treated the office like a courtroom and his mouth like a gavel. He thought everyone hung on his every word. He thought no one remembered the small cruelties, the casual humiliations, the whispered threats delivered at the edges of staff meetings. He thought wrong. It began, as all inevitable reckonings do, with a petty thing, a reprimand in front of the team for asking a question. He had called me soft in a meeting, laughed at the timbre of my voice when I tried to answer, and then walked away with that satisfied, territorial smugness of someone who believes they've defined the map. I left the room and sat in the stairwell and let the sting of it stack into something colder. I wrote an email when I climbed back to my desk, a careful, factual note describing the meeting, the comments, the exact sequence of events. Not accusatory, not dramatic. Just dates, times, the names of witnesses. I hit send and felt lighter. That was the first step. Record, document, do not rely on memory. It grew from there. For months I collected fragments, emails he sent that menaced rather than managed, performance reviews that contradicted what he had told employees in private, memos that repeated policies he'd already admitted not to follow. I wasn't hunting for revenge, not in the acute, cinematic way people imagine revenge. I was hunting for truth. Truth, I found, likes to announce itself in plain language if you're paying attention. If you can't keep up, you'll be out. We can always replace you. Make sure she knows she's lucky. He said those things, sometimes with a smile that made the words hurt less but meant them all the same. I kept my notes in a folder on my laptop labeled simply and boringly, work. I printed some emails and slid them into a physical binder. I dated everything. A few colleagues began to confide in me, cautiously, because they too had been reduced to laughter in meetings or given impossible deadlines. They did not want to be martyrs, who does? But they wanted their experiences acknowledged. We shared stories in quiet corners, traded screenshots and calendar invites that exposed patterns, meetings scheduled at impossible hours, performance metrics that seemed arbitrary, promises he never kept. Those quiet conversations were the second step. Build a chorus, not a solo. There was one evening I remember clearly, the way you remember the angle of light on a photograph. He had cornered Sarah, who ran the client accounts, and told her, loud enough for the hall to hear, that if she didn't sign off on an impossible contract revision, he would make sure she never worked in the industry again. He laughed afterward and called it a joke. But Sarah did not laugh. She texted me that night with a photo of the calendar invite for the meeting and a trembling sentence. He threatened me. The calendar invite had the time, the meeting title, the attendees. The attendees' names became witnesses. We took the next step carefully. We spoke to HR, or rather, we tried to. Our HR was the kind that smiled and deferred, slow as winter, but they could not ignore the paper trail. I moved methodically. Consolidated emails into a timeline, annotated messages with context, highlighted specific sentences, whereas language crossed from managerial into punitive. I asked colleagues if they would be comfortable corroborating what they had seen. Some declined. Some agreed. The ones who agreed signed brief, direct statements in their own handwriting. Their names, the date, their recollection. We avoided invective and kept to the facts. If you are building something that must stand up under scrutiny, you do not let anger be your architect. What changed everything, oddly, was a small technological quirk. He had a habit of forwarding his own emails to his assistant because he believed hearing himself, seeing his own words, made every decision feel more consequential. In doing so, he sometimes included stream of consciousness comments, fragments that showed why he acted the way he did. One forwarded thread contained a sentence that, when isolated, burned the whole narrative into clarity. If anyone challenges me, make it so uncomfortable they quit. It was a throwaway line in a long chain, a managerial aside meant for someone else's eyes, but it mapped perfectly onto months of behavior. We packaged the evidence and asked HR, this time with a different tone. We asked for an investigation, for a formal grievance process. We presented the timeline, the signed statements, the emails, the calendar invites, and the phrases that mattered. We were careful to show harm, how clients had been lost when employees left under duress, how team cohesion had frayed, how productivity metrics had slipped when people chose secrecy over collaboration. We did not moralize, we explained impact. The language mattered. I had watched his careless phrases do damage for years. Now I turned them into a story that could be verified. HR opened a case. That in itself was an odd, hollow moment. Triumph and dread braided together. I wanted him gone the way you want a fever ended because the person was dangerous, not because I enjoyed the thought of them on the street. But an investigation is a legal instrument. It moves slowly and requires care. We cooperated. We gave interviews. We answered questions with the same spareness we had used to document the offenses. Where my notes were meticulous, our testimonies were spare and steady. They analyzed emails, cross-checked signatures, spoke to clients who had been ghosted by our team when the boss refused to accept their concerns. The process was procedural, bureaucratic, unsentimental, which suited us. Truth, dressed in evidence, looks very ordinary. He was arrogant enough to bring his own defense in meetings. He repeated phrases he thought were clever. "We are a family here," he said, as if families do not fire people for incompetence and cruelty. He argued that he had only been tough because the market demanded it. He admitted, in one recorded meeting that found its way to HR, to pushing people to their limits. He laughed and called it tough love. The recording, which he had made himself during a training exercise, a practice session he'd suggested in his mania for self-improvement, captured a line that our catalog of complaints had been circling for months. It was the disconnect between the public face and the private intent that finally hardened the case. When HR presented their findings, they were clinical. They quoted emails. They cited policy breaches. They noted that several of his actions constituted harassment by company standards. The formal language disrobed the man's charm. He was given the options that come at the end of such bureaucratic arcs: remediation, suspension, a leave of absence, or termination. He chose fury. He said he had been betrayed. He spoke in that last meeting, using the same words he had used to shrink others. He accused us of collusion and cowardice. He threatened legal action. He promised to make sure our careers ended with nothing more than small, quiet ruins. I had learned, earlier, to save everything. I had copies of the threats he issued after the investigation, the veiled ones and the explicit ones. They were tokens of fear, trying to look like power. We handed them over to the company's counsel, who had remained at an arm's length until then, did what counsel does. They valued risk. The board valued reputation. The client who had once considered leaving withheld final approval until the situation resolved. Consequence is a social thing. Sometimes it arrives when enough people feel implicated. He was fired on a gray Tuesday. He packed his things from the desk like any man accustomed to his own importance, moving slowly, as if the world owed him time. He looked at colleagues he had humiliated and did not know how to read their faces. Some wept quietly. Others turned away so he could go. Management sent an email that was terse and formal, the kind that leaves out the human texture, so it cannot be scraped for scandal. He left with his legal threats and his baffled outrage. In the hallway, one of his former sycophants muttered, "He never saw it coming." I thought, but did not say, that the mistake was not that he didn't see it coming. The mistake was that he had assumed his words were only entertainment for himself. Words are footprints. They tell you where someone has been, and what they intended. After, there were cracks and repairs. The team took months to knit itself back together. Trust, once stretched thin, must be rewoven thread by thread. HR instituted clearer reporting channels. We had one long, clumsy meeting where we named the harms out loud and tried, as adults, to apologize for not intervening earlier. I apologized for not noticing, for not collecting evidence sooner. They apologized in their own ways. We tried not to make martyrs of ourselves or the man who had gone. Sometimes, late at night at my kitchen table, I think about the small ethics of what we did. Was it vindictive? Maybe, at first. Was it self-preserving? Certainly. But beneath those human motives was a quieter thing, a refusal to let language be weaponized without consequence. He had used his mouth like a shovel, burying people under comments and threats until they could not breathe. I used his own words against him, not to humiliate, he had already done that work, but to reveal. To make visible the pattern of harm he had stitched into everyday interactions. There are no cinematic endings in real life. There was no triumphant address in the town square, no poetic magnanimity. There was a series of memos and signatures, and a man leaving with a box. What lingered was the change in the office's atmosphere. People began to speak more carefully, not because they feared the return of a tyrant, but because they had seen that speech has consequences. They learned, the hard way, that power is not exempt from the law of being witnessed. I kept the binder for a long time after. I never opened it much. It was enough that it existed. I thought of how small acts, an email sent at 2 a.m., a calendar invite, a sign note, had added up to an outcome none of us would have predicted when that boss first smiled his cruel smile. In the end, it was his own language that did him in, the offhand threats, the forwarded confessions, the recorded boasts. He had always been argument and articulation. Someone finally decided to read his sentences as evidence rather than entertainment. That, perhaps, is the most ordinary and the most moral thing I learned, that the truth is not a thunderbolt but a slow accumulation, and that sometimes the only justice available is the kind you construct with patience, paper, and the courage to speak the facts aloud. The weeks after his departure had an almost surreal quietness to them, as though the building itself had exhaled after years of holding its breath. For so long, the rhythm of our workdays had been dictated by his moods. If he arrived in a rage, the day was already ruined. If he strutted in with that thin smile, we braced for the sharpness hidden behind it. Without him, the silence was strange, like the absence of a constant background noise you only notice when it's gone. At first, no one trusted it. We sat in meetings waiting for someone to explode. We drafted emails with triple the caution, rehearsing replies as if the ghost of his voice would leap from the screen to chastise us. Old habits die slowly, and fear, once installed, doesn't vanish overnight. But gradually, as the days accumulated without his interruptions, people began to relax. The nervous laughter that used to punctuate conversations softened into real laughter. I caught Sarah smiling at her screen one afternoon, not because she had to, but because she could. There was a subtle but undeniable shift in the way people carried themselves. Before, eyes stayed low, conversations were clipped, shoulders hunched under invisible weight. Now, posture straightened, voices rose, ideas flowed, without the immediate fear of ridicule. It wasn't utopia, no workplace ever is, but it was breathable again. The team began to remember what it meant to contribute without dread. What struck me most was how easily one person's cruelty can warp an entire ecosystem, and how quickly that same ecosystem begins to heal once the source of poison is gone. He had convinced so many of us that he was indispensable, that without his leadership, the company would collapse. But the truth revealed itself almost instantly. Productivity improved, clients responded more warmly, deadlines were met without the constant churn of last-minute panic he thrived on creating. The company didn't fall apart. It flourished. Of course, there were whispers about what had really happened. People speculated in the break room, passing rumors like trading cards. Some said he'd been caught embezzling. Others claimed the board had grown tired of complaints. Few knew the precise truth, though bits of it filtered out in fragments. I never corrected anyone. I didn't need recognition. What mattered was the result. Still, every time someone joked, "Guess he finally talked himself out of a job," I felt the faintest twitch of satisfaction. What lingered longest for me was the memory of his certainty. He truly believed words were weightless, that they evaporated after they were spoken, leaving no trace but the sting on the listener's skin. He underestimated the power of memory, the persistence of record-keeping, the courage of the collective. He never imagined his own careless sentences would become the net that caught him. I sometimes think of that binder, the one filled with his quotes, his emails, his contradictions. It sits in a locked drawer at home, untouched now, like a relic from a past life. I've considered destroying it, feeding the pages to a shredder, letting the history dissolve. But I never do. It isn't vengeance that keeps me from discarding it, it's a kind of reverence. It's proof that truth can endure, even in an environment built on fear. It reminds me of the lesson I nearly forgot in those dark days. Silence only helps the oppressor. Documentation, however small, is a form of resistance. In the end, I didn't defeat him with anger or shouting matches. I didn't outmaneuver him with cunning speeches. I simply held a mirror to his own voice. He had armed me himself. Every time he opened his mouth, every time he typed an email without thought. All I had to do was preserve it patiently until the weight of his own words was too heavy for him to carry. That's how he was undone. Not by rebellion, not by sabotage, but by the echo of his own voice. And sometimes, late at night when I think back on it, I realize there's a quiet poetry in that. He always believed words were his weapon. In the end, they were the blade he fell upon.